All right. Hello, everybody. I had a couple of technical difficulties, so I'm hoping that folks can hear me and that they can see me. And happy Martin Luther King Jr. Day, or the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Day. I thought I would share some reflections with you. So if you see me reading, it's an offering, and it's because I'm trying to look at my cell phone and my reading at the same time. So, with that, I'm just gonna head on into it and hope that y'all everything's going well. So, I did not wake up today planning to do a Facebook Live about MLK Day, but two things happened. First, I saw a few people that I really respect and admire sharing some whitewash versions of King's words and of his vision. And I'll admit, I thought we were beyond reducing MLK's words and visions to, his vision of beloved community. I thought we were beyond reducing that to a sanitized sentiment about peace and feeling good. He was really calling us to recognize how deeply embedded our minds, hearts, political structures, economic structures are embedded in a bloody empire. Like, he was really calling us deeply into that. So, I really want us to not do that on this day when we are celebrating him, to whitewash his words and whitewash his vision. I want us to really think about what he was calling us into. The second reason I decided to share was that actually I was looking for something else in my house, and I found a photo of my mom. And my mom, Claudia, Gardner, she has passed away. She was in charge for many years of planning the Martin Luther King Day celebration at the University of Minnesota. She's planned concerts, she's planned a lot of events, and I just really felt like, she wouldn't want me to let this day pass without making a contribution, without recognizing him, without lifting up him and his legacy in some way. So it's in that spirit of offering and honoring my mother and her legacy, and also in honoring Dr. King's legacy, that I give this reflection. I also offer it in a spirit of liberation and justice making through our faith, which is a core tenet of what we are trying to do at Blue. So I want to just start by noting that this message is really rooted in his book, Where Do We Go From Here? Chaos or Community? He wrote this book in 1967. He took some time, he went to Jamaica, and he locked himself away, and he penned this very prophetic and painfully relevant text to us still today. In this book, he explores a lot of different things, from how do we work together as people from different race and cultural backgrounds. He really goes deep on sort of the three big evils that he paints, that he sees of, hey, I see you, Christina, thank you, love you. He really paints, is calling us to look at militarism, capitalism, and racism as three evils of our world that we need to address. In his work and his life, he merged the ideas of resistance and revolution with nonviolence and political power into a synthesis, right, of tools that change the trajectory of the world. He similarly fused intellect with his love for God and humanity to discern an unshakable spiritual and theological foundation from which to change ourselves, our communities, and our world. That is deeply part of the legacy that he left us. So as we honor him on this day, we need to lift up his full humanity, and also lift up that he didn't do any of this on his own. None of it. He was flanked and supported by innumerable people who dedicated their lives to the civil rights movement. These people were gay, they were transgender, they were women, they were poor, they were teenagers, they were children, and the machines of patriarchy, transphobia, homophobia, and misogyny meant that people like Bayard Rustin were rendered invisible. People like Ella Baker were relegated to a backseat position. But just as each and every one of us in this movement is moving from what we know and operating within the inherited ideas that we received when we were born into this world, ideas that were predicated upon 3/5 of a lot of us being, ideas that were predicated upon the notion that we were only 3/5 human, right? So starting from that place, we need to understand that King was operating with all of these ideas too and pushing back against them, right? So while he rightly rallied against racism, capitalism, and militarism, he couldn't fully see misogyny in the same way, or patriarchy in the same way, or homophobia or transphobia in the same way. So I personally really do believe his theology and his penchant for intensely studying and discerning and asking questions again and again and again really would have led him to believe, that down the road, had he not been murdered, that, these things were also a part of evil in the world: misogyny, homophobia, transphobia, patriarchy. I really believe he would have come to a place where he would have seen those as just as evil and as a part and parcel of capitalism, militarism, and racism. So I want us to acknowledge that and lift that up and build on his legacy and the whole community of people around him, because he couldn't do any of it, like I said, without any of them. So, I think that this is the MLK that cannot be whitewashed, right? And what I mean by when I say whitewash is that too often people quote MLK sort of out of context and only holding on to comforting phrases and comforting notions of peace, right? We all, I think, in our deepest hearts want the world to be a peaceful, welcoming, kind place, and it isn't. He really held on to a vision, and he painted that picture for us time and time again, because as we're fighting in the trenches and as we're fighting for our full humanity, we need to hold on to that vision, because it's hard and we need to have that in front of us. But not ever once did he say, holding on to that vision means closing your eyes to what's right in front of you. And what's right in front of you is incredibly uncomfortable. If you have a moral conscience, it is deeply in your soul, like makes you uncomfortable, because it's so incredibly ugly, right? It is so incredibly ugly. So, if you're gonna try to quote, I have a dream without quoting, things that he said around violence against Black people, structural violence from economics, railing against hyper-militarism and critiquing our obsession with materials and money and capitalism, right? You're not really lifting him up. You're really kind of whitewashing that message. So I want to be sure that I'm not doing that on this day. I want to be sure that Blue's not doing that, and that in community we are really pushing ourselves to build on his theology and build on his foundation and say, okay, where are we transphobic? Where are we homophobic? Where are we still buying into capitalism, still buying into white supremacy, still buying into patriarchy? And what does our vision of beloved community look like? Can we name it? Can we say it? My vision of beloved community means that trans people are afforded their full human rights and dignity and love, right? Like, that is so powerful and something we really need to embrace and talk about. So with all of that, I want to lift up a passage from his book that is meant to make us uncomfortable. And I want to lift up this quote. It's a fairly long quote. I think it's worth it. And it is from the book, Where Do We Go From Here? Chaos to Community. I've said it before, I'll say it again. If you haven't read this book, read it. Because even though he penned this in 1967, it is so relevant today. He discusses, in depth, nonviolence, violence, what's the role for Black folks, what's the role for white folks, what's the role for, other people of color, how are we moving in solidarity, how are we having a global consciousness in an economy that's set up to oppress people globally, right? So this is the quote, and I actually can't tell you the pages because I have my copy is on my iBooks. On my phone. So I'm just going to encourage you to go find it in the book. And this is, and I'm going to take a sip of water before I go into it, but this is the quote that I want to lift up today. We must get rid of the false notion that there is some miraculous quality in the flow of time that inevitably heals all evils. There is only one thing certain about time. and that is that it waits for no one. If it is not constructively used, it passes you by. In this generation, the children of darkness are still shrewder than the children of light. They are always zealous and conscientious in using time for their evil purposes. If they want to preserve segregation and tyranny, they do not wait on time. They make time their fellow conspirator. If they want to defeat a housing bill, they don't say to the public, be patient, wait on time, and our cause will win. Rather, they use time to spend big money, to disseminate half-truths, to confuse the popular mind. But the forces of light cautiously wait, patiently pray, and timidly act. I'm going to read that line again. But the forces of light cautiously wait, patiently pray, and timidly act. So we end with a double destruction. The destructive violence of the bad people and the destructive silence of the good people. Equally fallacious is the notion that ethical appeals and persuasion alone will bring about justice. This does not mean that ethical appeals must not be made. It simply means that those appeals must be undergirded by some form of constructive, coercive power. If the Negro does not add persistent pressure to his patient plea, he will end up empty-handed. So every ethical appeal to conscience of the white man must be accomplished by nonviolent pressure. If a first-class citizenship is to become a reality for the Negro, he must, through a powerful action program, assume that primary responsibility for making it so. The only answer to the delay, double-dealing, tokenism, and racism that we still confront is through mass nonviolent action and the ballot. At times, these may seem too slow and inadequate, but they are the only real tools we have. Of course, of action must lie neither in passively relying on persuasion nor in actively succumbing to violent rebellion, but in a higher synthesis that reconciles the truths of these two opposites while avoiding the inadequacies and the ineffectiveness of both. With the person relying on persuasion, we must agree that we will not violently destroy life or property, but we must balance this by agreeing with the person of violence that evil must be resisted. By doing so, we avoid the non-resistance of the former and the violent resistance of the latter. With non-violent resistance, we need not submit to any wrong, nor need we resort to violence in order to right a wrong. Now, I want to pause here and just say there are absolutely discussions to be had about constructing violence against ideas of property, ideas that I think are worth discussion. I think today it's really important to lift up some kernels of what he is saying in this, right? And particularly the line where he says, this cautiously waiting, patiently praying, and timidly acting. I think our current federal regime has shown us what this sort of time will heal all wounds, or time moves, inevitably towards justice. It doesn't. We move it, and we move it by acting, and we move it not by acting carelessly or thoughtlessly or without strategy or single-handedly, but we move it by thinking together and moving from a place of shared consciousness and shared values. And I really deeply believe as well his point about power. I think that's part of the discussion that is missing from too many of our faith spaces. When we too often when we move into faith spaces and we need to hear both sides of the story, what is that? How does power affect that? How does power affect whose side is heard as credible and whose side is heard as less credible? How does power even affect that notion that there are quote unquote two sides of the story that are presumed sort of equally legitimate, right? I think that those notions have genuinely good origins in fairness, in recognizing the full humanity of each other. However, they are void of, when they are void of an analysis of power, they only re-entrench the systems, right? And so part of what I really hope that we're doing today, as part of MLK celebration, is really interrogating power. How is power in our UU churches, in our organizational structures, in our nonprofits? How is it, working for us, against us? Because in some ways it's working for us, and in some ways it's working against us, right? All of these things are true. I really want us to hold on to that. And when we hold on to that, we can also talk then too more deeply about misogyny, patriarchy, homophobia, transphobia. I will say part of what prompted me as well to make this address, this reflection, is when we decided to, act in solidarity and answer a call to do the Transphobia is Sin social media campaign. There was some pushback, right? There of course, there are a lot of beautiful people who said, yes, I can get on board with that. But there was also pushback. And in my mind, I was like really surprised and really floored at this pushback. How can people not believe that transphobia is a sin? How can people not, and by people specifically, I'm talking about particularly white UUs, who are the ones who had the most pushback about this. How can they not affirm the inherent worth and dignity of our trans siblings? I just couldn't get it. And I think, part of it was these discussions of, well, let's hear the other side. Let's hear what they have to say. But it's here where I really agree with James Baldwin, right? We can have a disagreement unless your disagreement is rooted in not recognizing my full humanity or somebody else's full humanity. Then it's not a disagreement, right? That is a degradation. So I really want us as Unitarian Universalists, Black Unitarian Universalists, as Indigenous folks, as non-Black folks, as Unitarian Universalists, I really want us to get more comfortable talking about power, assessing power, analyzing power within our communities, within our churches, within our institutions, within how we talk about things. I want us to understand that disagreement doesn't mean degradation, and that you can stay grounded in your values and call out degradation, and that is vitally important to the times we're facing right now. That is vitally important. We are seeing people's lives destroyed because too many of us on the progressive spiritual path and in the progressive spiritual movements have been unable to call a thing, have been unable to say, this is wrong, right? We've wanted to pray a lot. We've wanted to come to the right conclusion. I know there are still churches that are thinking about putting up a Black Lives Matter sign, right? This is a movement that came about years ago, and they're still now because they're in this process. Time waits for no one. And that's probably the second biggest piece I want to pull out of this. MLK really talks about how we can use this as a weapon, as a tool to serve us in our cause, or it will be used against us. But there is no just wait and time inevitably moves towards justice. That's not a thing. We move it. We move the bar, and we don't do it by being passive or waiting too long or being tepid in our responses. So that's what I have for you today. Reflection on MLK, a reflection to always go deeper, a reflection to always think about power, a reflection to understand that we each have areas of privilege in our lives where we can leverage, that privilege in the service of ending structural injustices. And it takes a thick skin, it takes being in community, it takes pulling together, and it takes courage. And I think we have it, and I think we can do it. I wouldn't be a Unitarian Universalist if I didn't believe that. I just hope we can keep moving forward together. So, with that, I want to name as well that I am on Indigenous land, that this country was founded, in genocide, and in slavery. And I think the more we can talk about that and face the realities of the legacy of that, I think the closer we can start to really bring our vision of beloved community down into and onto this earth while we're still living, while we're still breathing. Because if we aren't using time for us and in the service of our cause, it will and it is being used against us. So we need to change that. So I love y'all. Thank you for listening. Thanks for tuning in. And let's keep going. Blessings to you on this day.